Tell us a little bit about your book, your website, and your own perspective on the year 2012.
Right on. Okay, so my book is called 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl, and it was a 5-year undertaking. I'd written the first book about psychedelics and shamanism called Breaking Open the Head, and in that book I kind of transitioned from a purely kind of empirical, skeptical, materialist belief system to accepting like the realm of the psyche and shamanism, and that there was some kind of realm of psychic phenomena, kind of interconnectivity between the psychic and the physical. So that really changed my whole way of thinking about reality, and I found that I had to take, once I'd accepted that the shamanism had validity and that these tribal cultures had a kind of knowledge system that was very different than our own, I then had to start thinking seriously about what a lot of these cultures have to say about the time that we're in now. And then you discover there's a real coherent kind of understanding that a lot of traditional and tribal cultures have about this time. So, and the Mayan culture, which developed in the Yucatan from the 2nd to the 9th century A.D., is probably the most highly developed form of the kind of shamanic knowledge system. It really became a very evolved civilization, very sophisticated. And they did a huge amount of work on astronomical cycles and kind of suggesting there's some kind of linkage between cycles of astronomy and evolution of consciousness and civilization. And their kind of prophetic calendar, the end of the long count of their calendar, points to this year 2012 as some kind of transition or transformational threshold for human consciousness on the planet, I think.
Quetzalcoatl, this name that's mentioned in the title of your book. Tell us about this mythological being or entity that you're talking about, or energy.
Yeah, so it's a sort of God form archetype, the feathered serpent, the plumed serpent. So it represents the meeting of bird and snake, which could be seen as kind of an integration or fusion of what's in the air, spirit, heaven, with what's on the ground, kind of earth and matter. And I think it's an archetype of integration and the kind of superseding of perceived opposites or dualisms. And so one thing that I take it to mean in terms of this time that we're in now is it could represent this transformation of consciousness, where I think one of the really interesting things that's happening right now is this kind of esoteric, spiritual, mystical sort of knowledge system and the empirical, scientific, rational knowledge system of the West are kind of coming together and fusing. So it's not a question of negating either one, but it's as they kind of come together, a new perspective and a new form of consciousness is developing.
Daniel, we were talking about a lot of really intense information that's important to look at, but it's even more important on exactly how we perceive this information in our own lives, and where our power lies to recreate our own reality when we know that there are realities that others are trying to create that we don't actually want. A lot of people out there on the web and on the radio and on TV are talking about these massive changes that we're experiencing right now. We kind of really jumped from the news to this far-out topic of 2012. Could you break down in your own research and perspective what's happening to humanity today, all the changes we're looking at, not only in the planet itself, but major changes happening in the political spectrum, major changes happening with people, with relationships, and also related areas?
Well, I mean, I'd love to. Unfortunately, that's like 10 questions in one.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess like my simplest way of looking at this transition or transformation, kind of cycle that we're in is you could look at it as like, changes in the biosphere, the technosphere, and what some people call the noosphere. So, obviously we're having this massive ecological crisis. Climate change is accelerating. Species extinction crisis is very acute. Probably the worst problem we face at this point. So that, according to some scientists, in 30 years, 25% of all species are going to be extinct. All these feedback loops in the climate system have been engaged. And so this is, sort of a lot of it really caused by unconscious human action, or human action performed without forethought. And then we have a whole technological evolution, which is massively kind of transforming both of our creative and destructive capabilities and kind of accelerating them, accentuating them. And I think we're also seeing a change in kind of the nature of the human self and the psyche due to technology, so that the social networks and email are in a way kind of re-tribalizing humanity in a way. So we don't have a sense of an existential, isolated self anymore. It's more like a kind of permeable, socially constructed and mediated self. So in a way, I see that as potentially positive and pointing towards a positive development. And then I also see that there's a psychic evolution on the level of the noosphere, which kind of means the thought envelope around the Earth. And for me, there's, and for most, as I've been anecdotally exploring this and, through shamanism and my own, investigation, there's a lot of people are experiencing a lot more synchronicities, a lot more telepathic events, even kind of manifestation, stuff that movies like The Secret and What the Bleep talk about. It's a sense that almost the psychic and the physical are not as separate as they once were, that boundary is becoming more and more kind of permeable. So that's also magnifying our kind of intention. So if you have kind of negative stuff, project in you, that just gets projected out in more and more powerful forms. So in a way, we're really seeing, I think that, we could talk about the apocalypse really meaning like uncovering or revealing. So it's a time when, all the sort of hidden aspects of the human psyche get kind of poured out in front of us.
Yes, exactly. It's an old question. Is it really the end or the beginning of another chapter of humanity? Daniel, you were talking at the lecture at PALS about your early experiences when it came to your consciousness changing. When you were living in the city, when you were living in New York City, and nothing made sense to you at a certain point in your life, except the natural world. This is something that I've experienced, other people have experienced, and I've always felt and tried to push the idea that truth isn't something that can be easily written out in a book. It's something that we kind of, in our own way, have to stumble upon. Sometimes truth is constantly coming at us. All we have to do is just open our eyes. Could you take us back to that moment in your life where things begin to change for you?
Yeah, well, I really described the process in both books, but definitely for me, psychedelic substances were a huge catalyst for change. Excuse me. And I sort of hit this existential crisis in my late 20s. And at that point, I really went back through my past life up to that point and tried to really find some kind of access point. And then I remembered that I had these really extraordinary psychedelic experiences with mushrooms and LSD. And so I was a journalist, so I was able to explore that rigorously. So I got assignments to take an Amazonian psychedelic medicine called ayahuasca, which tribes use throughout the whole Amazon. And also I went down to West Africa, went to a tribal with a tribe called the Bwiti, using a substance called iboga.
Iboga is particular to African shaman?
Yeah, exactly. It's only found in the equator of Africa, and it's actually being used as a treatment tool for addictions, for heroin and cocaine addiction. And it seems to have some very powerful results, positive results with that.
It's been said that when the power of love is greater than the love of power, that at that point we're going to know peace. And so, although there's a lot of darkness happening in the world, there is a lot of people waking up. There are a lot of authors such as yourself that are sharing information that is readily available all over the world. If you look at the beauty of the technological revolution instead of just the dark aspects of it. When you talk about the increase in synchronicity and psychic awareness, give us an overview of a wide spectrum of different things that we may want to keep our eyes open for in terms of not only in our own perceptions and perspectives growing in terms of awareness, but also in other areas.
Yeah, well, I think there's been a evolution, of consciousness or intensification of consciousness. So, like Mark Twain had written an essay about all these weird synchronicities in his life, but then, Carl Jung tried to kind of formulate a whole scientific or psychological theory about it. And Carl Jung really recognized that synchronicities pointed towards a kind of interrelationship or interconnectivity of mind and matter, or mind and worlds. He also recognized that most people weren't able to kind of deal with that at his point in time. And I think now we're more able to deal with that, 50 years later. And part of that is the integration of Eastern metaphysics and shamanism and the psychedelic experience have kind of opened more and more people to what Jung called the reality of the psyche. And, there's a lot of different studies. There's the Institute of Noetic Sciences that have been doing sorts of studies. Dean Radin has a book called, The Conscious Universe. So there's really a whole century of statistical evidence for psychic effects. And in my book, I talked about the Hopi and their rain dances, and how this anthropologist who lived with them for years, who was like Cambridge trained and a skeptic, had to admit that sometimes these rain dances would work. That he would go and it'd be like a clear blue day, 120 degree, burning hot sky and sun, and they would dance for half an hour, and sometimes clouds would start to gather and rain would fall. And so, that to me is really interesting if we think about how our unconscious actions have pushed us into this climate crisis. It might be that this crisis that we're entering is kind of the necessary crucible to bring about our own inner work, our own psychic transformation. And we might even be doing a collective psychic ceremonial work to work with elemental conditions at some point.
So in all essence, we're also really talking about the subconscious itself changing. That is the programming in the software known as our own brain that kind of dictates some of our urges, our instincts, our reactionary methods of dealing with the world. It's interesting to look at that. And I'm curious, have you seen anything to the effect of I've gotten a lot of emails and phone calls about numerology, people seeing 111s on the clock or connections with 113s or 11s and 33s, patterns within numbers tied in with this synchronicity. I noticed there are some people that are beginning to talk about it, and I don't exactly know what it is, but I know it's something. What's your perspective on that particular issue?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's potentially some interesting stuff there. Numbers may be a little bit different than we think they are. They may have a kind of a magical or a numinous quality. So I mean, this this kind of prophesied transformation date, is December 21st, 2012. Which is 12/21/12. The Mayans had this whole like 20 by 13 matrix. So 2012 then gives way to 2013. It almost seems to be referencing the Vulcan matrix. It's almost like there are hidden puzzle pieces in our kind of relationship to time and space. They're almost like a little winking at, as if some kind of higher dimensional consciousness is winking at us from beyond the framework of the kind of linear space and time that we normally feel that we're living in.
It is a strange world that we're living in, Daniel. On the topic of fractals, what I find interesting about this artwork is it kind of exemplifies this idea. You think about reality and whether it's finite or not. And to the best that we can understand through science, it appears to be an infinite reality in terms of the macrocosm to the microcosm. Explain to us your perspective on fractals and that concept.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I have I'm not a mathematician. I don't know if I have too much more of a perspective than you just vocalized. There's a really neat book, The Holographic Universe, by this guy Michael Talbot, which looks at all these theories that suggest that that the universe has holographic properties, so that it's like the deeper in you go, you're still gonna end up with the whole piece.
Now, how did crop circles? This is a first for my show for the topic to come up. But I was interested in hearing your perspective. It was a little different than some other people's perspective on crop circles. And you briefly were talking about in your speech. Tell us a little bit about that and what part that plays in your book.
Yeah, so as I was doing the book, I kind of entered the shamanic mind state, and part of that was being very attentive to, coincidences and synchronicities, and I ended up doing a piece for Wired magazine about crop circles. And I interviewed a bunch of researchers and scientists and so on. And, one of them told me that he thought the crop circles were connected to 2012. And, I was already collecting material about that for a possible book. So that was surprising. And then, as you get into the crop circles, I had at first sort of assumed that was probably just a hoax. But, I began to discover the patterns were, of incredible virtuosity and complexity. The ones that were kind of claimed by humans didn't have that kind of sort of magnitude of perfection. And then, talking to scientists, apparently there's been a number of biophysicists who studied what happens to the crop in these formations. They've discovered that there are molecular changes to the crop, kind of node lengthening effects and so on, that couldn't be caused by, them being just knocked down by people. They would really have to be caused by some kind of microwave energy or electromagnetic energy coming from above. So they put together papers, and they published their papers on this in peer-reviewed science journals. So that means that a community of scientific peers approve this research. which basically means that the science in the crop circles now stands at them somehow being created from some kind of high and fast energy coming from above, which corresponds to what people have seen of the crop circles being made, which is usually some kind of ball of light going over the crops, and the pattern's just kind of falling down within like 10 seconds. So then there are mathematicians. The chief astronomer at Boston University studied them for years and found new geometrical paradigms, unknown Euclidean theorems sort of hidden in even very simple formations. So yeah, it seems to be that the more I got into it, the more, although there's an element of indeterminacy, you never really can say for sure, it began to seem to me that the whole phenomenon was somehow like a teaching on the nature of reality, or teaching on the nature of consciousness that was really connected to this transformation process that we're in right now.
Daniel, I think the very act of questioning the status quo when it comes to possibility and reality really frightens some people. Some people don't exactly like the fact that maybe every now and then I'll have someone on the show with a different perspective, a more spiritual perspective, to looking at some of these news headlines that we went over, a different way of looking at the world, if you will, if it can't be scientifically proven or otherwise. What's your response to that? People stuck in their ways, in the box. Personally, I feel like it's a personal choice. We all kind of come and investigate what is reality on our own free will and volition. But what is your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think that what I tried to do in my work in 2012 especially is really like put together a paradigm that is not, against rationality or science, but actually is ultimately more rational. But it just allows in for all this other data that the normal empirical materialist paradigm just won't let in. And for me, like a lot of people who claim to be skeptics are actually not rigorously skeptic. They're materialists, and their skepticism applies to anything that falls out of their belief system. And I think that in a sense, like, I was lucky that somehow or other I was very rigorously skeptical. I mean, I was even skeptical of my skepticism. So and in my work, I don't say that I I'm saying this is definitely the truth or the only truth, but it's more like a kind of thought experiment or attempt to create a hypothesis that really takes all these different types of evidence, including psychic evidence and internal evidence, into account. Not just the kind of type of objective, quantifiable data that materialists sift through.
Daniel, the last question before we let you go, and this is kind of a long question, I suppose, if you will, so we'll leave some time for that. You're definitely clearly an optimist. And so when it comes to reality, this world we're moving into in the years leading up here to 2012 and beyond, what kind of reality do you see in terms of hope, in terms of how we can change our own reality, getting back into basically being aware of really all that is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to put a quick plug in for a new web magazine I started called The Reality Sandwich, realitysandwich.com, where a lot of these kind of issues are explored. And, for me, the more that you begin to understand that somehow intention and consciousness are kind of, our intention is somehow shaping the reality that kind of unfolds, then I feel there's actually a responsibility to be as kind of visionarily positive as you can possibly be. I mean, not to be Pollyannish or ignore the negative things that are happening. And, so for me, and I'm actually very interested in, even like materialist critiques, like post-Marxist critiques of our current situation. I mean, one of my favorite books right now is this book, Multitude, by Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, which is a kind of post-Marxist critique of society and really looking at how labor system and the value system has shifted since Marx's analysis. And they really see tremendous kind of evolutionary and revolutionary potential in this time that we're in. And I really see that too. I think that on a subliminal level, it doesn't always come to consciousness, but there's been a lot of preparation for what could be a quick shift into potentially a higher order planetary culture. And people have done a lot of inner work in preparation, and also some outer work. And there are a lot of techniques that just need to be as zealously and vigorously applied and as promoted as like iPods or whatever. So whether it's relocalizing food production, looking at bioremediation, using like Paul Stamets mushrooms, mycology systems, whether it's looking at how we could use the internet as a tool for direct democracy and resource sharing and social transformation, and how social networks point towards a different kind of organizational paradigm for civilization. And this stuff there's a lot of stuff, alternative energy systems. There's a lot of stuff that's really tangibly available to us. It's just a question of the collective will and the sort of social energy shifting rapidly in this direction, so we can get this necessary work done. And we really don't have time. I just read Naomi Wolf's The End of America, where she looks at correlates the Bush administration and previous moves towards fascist regimes, and basically sees that there's a lot of parallels in what's been happening. We don't have time on a biospheric level to go through the whole, fascist, sort of cancer of that fascist psyche, tumor developing, exploding, wars and so on, Iran, World War IV. I mean, if you look at what's happening in the biosphere and the species extinction crisis, we need to turn around the global culture at a much faster rate, and I think we can do it. I think it's available to us. It's just it requires a sort of shift in our frequency of consciousness and our activity.
I agree with that. It's a difficult thing to discuss, though, because when you do look at some of those things, there is an integration when it comes to these multiple cycles, the big changes happening within the political spectrum. They are seeking, and provable, to grab as much power as they can over natural resources in a short span of time as we move towards 2012. So when it comes to consciousness shifting, major changes in how our government does business and interacts in our life actually has to change. There has to be some sort of deconstruction of the systems of control. So I'm just curious on your perspective on how about that actually happens and manifests.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that we have, there are sort of critical moments, and I think like the fall of the Berlin Wall was a good example. There was no predictions by political analysts or think tank analysts that the wall could fall without there being a lot of violence and nuclear exchanges and so on. So in a way, it just happened because subliminally people couldn't take it anymore. They were done with it. And I feel we may actually, although once again it doesn't often get expressed consciously, be reaching a similar kind of critical threshold with our current system. I mean, if you look at I wrote a piece for this magazine, Conscious Choice, about the current financial crisis, and how if you look at the mortgage, subprime mortgage market crisis, you basically are seeing that this financial system is built on air, and could basically collapse like a house of cards. And apparently there are even people like, George Soros has been saying to people that he doesn't think that a currency is going to have any value in a few years.
Well, the U.S. economy is crumbling, but the corporate wealth isn't. So I understand that for our society to evolve, we need to move back into permaculture, growing our own food, having a deeper understanding with nature. But it's going to be an interesting shift, Daniel, because there's less and less land to grow the food right now. And with actual ownership of private offshore companies, foreign companies, and major international transnational corporations, there has to be a shift into who owns what when it comes to sharing the land so we can grow food.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully we can get through that with as minimal amount of pain as possible.
It's definitely going to be interesting, and all bets are off. But I have this I have the sense that there's really the potential for tremendous positive transformation right around the corner. It's almost like this last kind of it's like this giant pus-filled wound is kind of exuding its last fetid odor, before we can move on to something else. And I think people are really just done, done with this, the patterns of the past on a lot of levels.
The old belief systems, the old paradigms, absolutely. It's going to be an interesting ride. I'm glad you and I were able to connect, people can go check out your website if they like, breakingopenthehead.com. You can learn more about...
actually, the website I'm really promoting is this magazine, realitysandwich.com.
Reality Sandwich.
And of course, the books, 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl, is my best effort to really put all this stuff into articulation.
Excellent. I'm glad you were able to make it on with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.